Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to knit the moss stitch hat in 10 different sizes with worsted or sport weight yarn. So let's get started. So this pattern is a relatively simple style of hat and can be for male or female. It's very simple. It's just a plain textured knit close-fitting hat, and the pattern gives instructions for 10 different sizes in both sport weight and worsted weight yarn. I'm going to show you the worsted weight version because it's a little easier to see on camera because it's thicker, but the sport weight version is basically identical in construction, and the actual numbers for how many stitches to cast on, where to put your stitch markers, etc., are given in the pattern, whether you're working with worsted weight or sport weight yarn. So I'm going to show you the basic method of construction for this hat in worsted weight yarn. And here's what you're going to need. Whether you're doing a worsted weight or a sport weight hat, you're going to need a circular knitting needle, or you're going to need some double pointed knitting needles. So I'm doing the worsted weight one. I'm using a US size 8 circular knitting needle. This one is 16 inches long, and I also have, because these are interchangeable needles, I have a 32-inch cable that I can attach to the same tips to make the cable longer, because at the end of the hat, when it starts to get smaller, at the crown when we do the decreases, it's going to be too small in circumference for the 16-inch needle. So I'm going to switch to the 32-inch and use the magic loop method to finish the decreases instead of using double pointed needles. If you want to use double pointed needles, you use your double pointed needles all the way through. So if you're doing the worsted weight, you're going to use a size 8. If you're doing the sport weight, you're going to use a size 4. But the lengths are going to be the same. If you're doing sport weight, you're going to need size 4 double pointed needles, and you're going to need 5 double pointed needles. For the worsted weight, you're going to need 5 size 8 double pointed needles. You're going to need the yarn that you want to make your hat out of. The amount will depend on the size that you've chosen and whether you've chosen worsted or sport weight. So you're also going to need some locking or split ring style stitch markers. I have quite a few here, but you're going to need about 4. I have a ruler for measuring gauge, I have some scissors, and some tapestry needles. If you want to use plastic yarn needle, you can, but I find tapestry needles a whole lot easier to use. Now, one thing you're going to need to take note of is that the preemie size and 0 to 6 months size are too small around to use a 16-inch circular needle. So unless you have a circular needle shorter than 16 inches, you're going to have to use double pointed needles for size preemie and size 0 to 6 months. Now, there are a lot of sizes in this pattern, so I recommend printing it out. You can get the printable pattern on my website. I recommend printing it out and using a pen or a highlighter to either circle or highlight the numbers that apply to the size that you've chosen to make. So the sizes included in this pattern are size preemie, 0 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, 12 to 18 months, child small, child medium, child large, adult small, adult medium, and adult large. And all of the measurements and head circumference and all of that is in the written pattern. So in the worsted weight version, our gauge is 16 stitches to 4 inches in the moss stitch and 26 rows to 4 inches. In the sport weight, you're going to have 27 stitches to 4 inches in the moss stitch and 32 rows to 4 inches. So I'm going to choose a stitch marker to start with, and we're going to start by casting on. So here's my 16-inch needle. We're always going to start with the 16-inch needle, again, unless you're working those 2 smallest sizes that require double pointed. So I'm going to start by casting on, and I'm making the adult small in the worsted weight version, so I'm going to cast on 76 stitches with a long tail cast on. And whatever size that you are making, you can go by the number that is given for that size. So go ahead and highlight the numbers for the size that you're making all through the pattern before you start, and that will help you keep the numbers straight to make sure that you're following the instructions for the correct size. So you're going to want to count and double check to make sure that you have the correct number of stitches. I have extra yarn left from my long tail, So I'm just going to trim that off so that it doesn't get in the way. You want to leave at least 6 inches or so. And now we're going to join to work in the round. So the first thing you're going to do is lay it out on your lap or your work surface and make sure that your cast on edge is not twisted. You want that cast on edge to run flat all the way around the inside of your circular needle. And now we're going to join to work in the round. So I ran across a really cool trick to join to work in the round. So what you're going to do first is insert your right needle into the first stitch on the left needle, which is your slip knot. And then you're going to reach across with your left needle and insert into what was the first stitch on the right needle and pull it over as if to bind off, but don't drop it. So now the first stitch on the left needle is now on the right needle tip, and the last stitch on that was the last stitch on the right needle tip is now crossed over onto the left. So now we're going to place our stitch marker right here on the needle. And this stitch marker is going to mark the beginning / end of our round. Now, if you're casting onto double pointed needles, you're going to approximately divide your stitches evenly onto 4 of the needles. You're going to use the 5th one to knit with. And you're going to clip your stitch marker onto the cast on edge, the last stitch of the cast on edge, to mark where your beginning and end of round is, because when you cast on with double pointed needles, you'll have one here and one here, and of course you'll have the other 2 to make the square, but those where that gap is between the last one and the first one is going to be helping you to know where the end of your round is, on top of having the stitch marker. So round 1 is very simple. We're going to work some basic 1x1 ribbing for a little bit to create the brim of the hat. So round 1 is going to be knit 1, purl 1 around, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, etc., etc., all the way back around to that marker. So as you can see, I know this is the adult small and I'm on a 16-inch needle, but if you kind of stretch it to where it would normally be stretched, this needle is going to be smaller than the actual circumference of this size. So the smaller sizes, except for those smallest 2, will fit on a 16-inch needle, because if you see here how I've scrunched all of a lot of the extra stitches onto the needle tip, you'll still have, you know, space on the needle for all of the stitches that you're going to need for most of the smaller sizes, again, except those 2 smallest sizes, and it won't be too tight and you won't have to be pulling it around to knit around it. So I'm just going to keep working round 1, which is knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way around until I get back to the marker, and then I will show you what that looks like. Alright, so I'm just about back around to my stitch marker. I've got one more knit and one more purl left before the stitch marker. So there's my stitch marker, and I'm just going to slip the marker at the end of the round. So you should still have the same number of stitches that you started with, and the pattern does tell how many stitches you should have at the end of the round. And now to work the rest of the ribbing, we're going to keep repeating round 1, which is what we just did. And the pattern will tell you how many rounds, how many times you should repeat round 1, how many rounds of ribbing you should have total, and how many inches it should be from the cast on edge. So I'm going to keep repeating round 1, which is knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, all the way around, and slip the marker at the end until my ribbing is long enough and I've done the correct number of rows of ribbing. Alright, so I have finished the last round of my ribbing and I've slipped my marker, and I've also double checked to make sure that my ribbing is the correct length and that I've worked the correct number of rounds for the size that I am making. So now we're going to start the moss stitch section, which is very simple. For rounds 2 and 3, we're going to do purl 1, knit 1 all the way around. The last number of rounds that we did for the ribbing was knit 1, purl 1. Now we're going to do purl 1, knit 1. So all the stitches that were knit stitches in the ribbing are now purl stitches, and all the stitches that were purl stitches in the ribbing are now knit stitches. So I'm just going to keep purling one and knitting one all the way around until I get back to my marker, and then I'll show you what that looks like. Alright, so I'm back around to the marker. I'm going to slip the marker. So that was round 2, and for round 3 we're going to do the exact same thing. Rounds 2 and 3 are the same. So we just did round 2, now we're going to do round 3, which is exactly the same as round 2. Purl 1, knit 1 all the way around. Purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, etc., all the way back around to the marker. And this time, because we are doing the exact same round as we did before, the stitches are going to match up. It won't line up with the knits and purls from the ribbing because it's not supposed to. But because we're doing the same round twice, then we'll have 2 rows of purl 1, knit 1, and they will line up. Those 2 rows will line up with the knits and the purls. Alright, so I'm back around to the marker. Those are my last stitches. I'm going to slip the marker. So those are rounds 2 and 3 with the purl 1, knit 1 all the way around. You should still have the same number of stitches that you started with. And now we're going to work round 4, which is the opposite of rounds 2 and 3. So for round 4, we're going to knit 1, purl 1. Rounds 2 and 3 we did purl 1, knit 1. Now we're going back to knit 1, purl 1. So now I'm going to knit 1 and purl 1 all the way around until I get back to my marker. So I'm back around to my marker. I'm going to slip the marker, and now we're going to work round 5, and round 5 is the same as round 4. We're going to knit 1, purl 1 all the way around, just like we did in round 4. Alright, I'm back around to my marker, so I will slip that marker. So here's what our moss stitch is going to start looking like. This right here is the end of my ribbing. So as you can see, the purl 1, knit 1 for 2 rows and the knit 1, purl 1 for 2 rows makes this lovely texture. And if you're looking at my hat right now and thinking that it looks way too small to be an adult small, that's because it's on the shorter needle. The needle does not show how big around it actually is because it is being kind of scrunched together on the needle. Not to the point where it's hard to work with, but you know, it's pretty comfortable. But it is going to be bigger once it comes off the needles than what it looks like right now because it is all kind of drawn up together onto that needle. So you should still have the same number of stitches on your needle as you did when you started. And to work the straight section of the hat before the decreases, which is what we're on right now, we're going to keep repeating rounds 2 to 5 until you have the correct number of rounds of moss stitch for your size that you're working. The pattern also tells you how long it should measure once you finish the correct number of rounds. And you should always be ending with round 2 or round 4. Now some sizes will end with round 2 and some sizes will end with round 4. The pattern will tell you which round your size is supposed to end with because you have to end with round 2 or round 4 to correctly begin the decrease portion of the hat. So I'm going to keep repeating my rounds 2 to 5 until I have the correct number of rounds of moss stitch for the size I'm doing and it is the correct length. And then I will show you what that looks like and we can start the decrease portion of the hat. So I have worked the correct number of rounds of moss stitch for the size that I'm making, and my piece measures the correct length. And the size that I'm working with ended with round 4. The pattern will tell you which sizes are supposed to end in round 4 and which sizes are supposed to end in round 2. But it either has to end with one or the other, and there is a specific round that it should end with. So again, when you're repeating rounds 2 through 5, you should have the correct number of rounds of moss stitch specified in the pattern for the size you're making. It should be the correct length specified in the pattern for the size you're making, and it will always end with either round 2 or round 4. And the pattern does tell you which it should end with, whether the size you're making should end with round 2 or with round 4. My size ends with round 4. So I'm going to now continue by following the directions that apply to my size, whether it ended with round 2 or round 4. Now, if you're making the sport weight version, the sport weight version does not have this extra step that I'm about to mention in between this part and the main set of decreased rounds that decreases the crown of the hat. For the worsted weight version, however, in most sizes, there is required an extra step, which is an extra pair of special decreased rounds, because our decreased rounds decrease 8 stitches per round, and we have 4 basic lines of decreases that meet at the center of the hat. And so we decrease 8 stitches per round, and because we do that, the stitch multiple for those rounds to work correctly has to be a multiple of 8. And currently in most sizes, at this point of the hat, most sizes of the worsted weight version do not have a stitch count that is a multiple of 8. And the reason that is because it has to be the correct head circumference. So we need that different number that's not a multiple of 8 to get the correct head circumference. So we have to now bring the stitch count down to a multiple of 8. So what we have here is the pattern will continue to give you sizes and specific round instructions, decreased round instructions for each size. Size 0 to 6 months, child large, and adult medium do not require this extra step. In the pattern, this is called a preliminary pair of decreased rounds. So on the size that I'm working, which is the adult small, there is a preliminary pair of decreased rounds. I currently have 76 stitches, which is not divisible by 8. So I have to get rid of some stitches to have a multiple of 8 so that I can work the rest of the decreases. So this is where your extra stitch markers will come in. Some of the sizes need to have multiple stitch markers. If for the size I'm working, I need 1 more stitch marker than, besides the one that I already have. So for the adult small, which is the one I'm working, the pattern says to place a marker after the 38th stitch. So right here is my marker for the beginning and end of round, and this begins the number of stitches in the round. So I'm going to count to the 38th stitch and place a marker on my needle after it. So here's where my marker is supposed to go. I'm just going to clip it onto the cable. This is why I tell you to use a locking stitch marker or a split ring stitch marker. And if you're using double pointing needles, then you can also do the same. If you don't want to put it on your needle, then you can loop it through in between those 2 stitches like this by just picking up a strand of yarn that runs in between those 2 stitches. But I'm going to clip it onto the cable needle, onto the cable of my circular needle, because I find that a little bit more convenient with a circular needle. So now we're going to work this preliminary pair of decreased rounds, which is very simple. And for the adult small, which I'm just going to keep referring to that because that's the one I'm demonstrating here, it says to knit 1, purl 1 to 4 stitches before the marker. So I'm going to knit 1 and purl 1, knit 1 and purl 1 until I get till 4 stitches before that marker. Now if you're working a different size that requires a different number of decreases or has multiple markers involved, then you will also follow the instructions until it tells you to stop. For example, in this one it says 4 stitches till the marker, and you may have more markers than I do, because this particular size only needs to get rid of 2 pairs of stitches. Because we're working in moss stitch, you can't just get rid of 1 stitch, because if I were to get rid of 1 stitch, I would have 2 knit stitches next to each other, which breaks up the moss stitch pattern. See, if here's a knit stitch, here's a purl stitch, here's another knit stitch, if I were to decrease right here and make that knit stitch and purl stitch into one, I'd either have a knit stitch and then a knit 2 together, or a purl two together and then a purl stitch, and that would break up the moss stitch pattern. So with this pattern, we're doing double decreases that decrease 2 stitches at a time. And that is why we're decreasing, that's why I say we're decreasing a pair of stitches and not just one. So my size that I'm working needs to decrease 2 pairs of stitches. Some sizes only need to decrease 1 pair of stitches. Some may need to decrease 3 pairs of stitches. But the pattern will specify exactly what to do for which size you are working, the exact instructions for the round, so you don't have to try to figure out anything. So I'm just going to keep knitting and purling until I get to 4 stitches until the marker. So here we are. I've got 4 stitches left until the marker. Then it tells me to knit 1. And then it says slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front. So I'm going to bring the yarn to the front and slip the next stitch by inserting my right needle into it as if to purl, and just sliding it over onto my right needle without doing anything to it. Now it says I'm going to purl 2 together. So I'm going to keep the yarn in front, insert my right needle into the next 2 stitches as if to purl, and purl those 2 stitches together. Now it says PSSO, which means pass slip stitch over. So here's my purl 2 together, and here's the stitch that I slipped before it. I'm going to insert my left needle into that slip stitch, bring it over the purl 2 together as if I were binding it off, and we have now decreased 2 stitches by making 3 stitches into 1. So then it says to slip marker. So if your size has only 1 double decrease in it for this preliminary round, then you're just going to follow the instructions to get to the end of your round. If you have multiple markers aside from the one that is the end of round marker, then you're going to need to repeat what we just did, knitting and purling, until you get to the marker. And some of the preliminary decrease rounds will tell you to purl 1, knit 1, because that depends on where you are in the pattern. So some sizes will have ended with round 2, and some sizes will have ended with round 4. So each preliminary pair of decrease rounds is going to already be correct for the pattern to keep the pattern going seamlessly without having any weird breaks or jumps in it. So everything is already written to not be complicated or anything. All you have to do is follow the instructions given in the written pattern. And for my size, it says to now knit 1 and purl 1 until I get to the next marker, which is my end of round marker. And then I'm going to work that double decrease again. So for the other rounds, the opposite ones that are purl 1, knit 1, when you're decreasing, then it's going to be a knitwise double decrease. And I will show you that a little bit later on, because all sizes require both to make the texture pattern work correctly. So you will see me demonstrate that a little bit later on when I get into the main decreases. So here I am, 4 stitches before the marker. I'm going to knit 1, slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, and then I'm going to purl those last 2 stitches together and pass the slip stitch over the purl 2 together. So that's my second decrease. Now I'm going to slip my marker because that's the end of my round. So I now have the correct multiple of stitches to work the main set of decrease rounds. But because we work these rounds in pairs, we're now going to work there's a round 2, which is very simple. It's just going to be purl 1, knit 1 around, because that is what the texture pattern requires. So I'm going to purl 1, knit 1 all the way around, and then I'm going to slip my marker. And when I come to the marker that I had placed here for my decreases in the previous round, I'm just going to slip it, because we don't need to work any decreases in the second round of our pair of decrease rounds. Alright, so I'm going to slip my end of round marker. So now that I have finished my preliminary decrease rounds, again, if you're working the sport weight version, You will not have any of those because they are not required. All of the stitch numbers, all the stitch counts in the Sport Weight version are already a multiple of 8. So now we're going to remove all the markers except the one that designates the beginning of the round. So I only have one extra marker besides the one at the beginning of the round. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that because now we're going to place new markers. So what we're going to do here is divide the number of stitches into fourths with our stitch markers. And for the size that I'm working, I need to place markers after every 18th stitch. And the pattern will tell you exactly where to place all of the markers that you're going to need. So I'm going to need 3 markers aside from the one that's already on my needles that marks the beginning of the round. And I like to use a different color. So this dark purple one is marking the beginning and end of the round, and these lighter purple ones are the mid-round markers so that I know exactly which one is the beginning of the round and which of the markers is just for telling me where I need to put a decrease. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to count, and after every 18th stitch, because that's the number that my size specifies in the pattern, it will give the numbers for every single size. After the X number of stitch, put a marker on your needle. So I'm going to count, and after every 18th stitch, I'm going to place a marker onto my needle. So there's the 18th. I'm going to put a stitch marker after it, and then I'm going to start counting from here again and go to the 18th after that. So here's the next one, and I'm going to place a marker there on the cable of my circular needle. And here's the last one. And it's going to clip on right there. So then I should still have 18 stitches left. And I do. And this divides the stitches evenly into fourths. Now if you're using double pointed needles, you're just going to make sure that they are divided onto the needles in fourths, because you should be using 4 double pointed needles to hold your stitches, and the 5th one is for the knitting. So if I were doing this on double pointed needles, then I would need to have 18 stitches on each double pointed needle. So if the pattern says to work until there were 4 stitches left before the marker, you're going to work until there are 4 stitches left before the end of your double pointed needle, because it should have the same number of stitches on one double pointed needle as I have between markers here. So if you're using double pointed needles, you don't have to place markers and you don't have to slip markers, but you need to keep the marker that marks the end of your round, which if you're using double points will be either at the cast on edge, or if you want to keep moving it up as you go, you can do that. So we're now going to work the regular decrease rounds. And if you're using circular needles, there will come a point where the hat circumference is too small for the length of the needle. So at that point you can switch to the 32-inch cable, or if you have a separate needle, like if you have a fixed circular knitting needle is what I mean, then you can switch to the 32-inch needle. I'm just going to switch cables because I have interchangeable needles. And you can continue with the magic loop method, or you can switch to double pointed needles. So because we're working with the moss stitch, which has 2 pairs of rounds to create the texture, we have to work our decreases in pairs. So there are 2 pairs of decrease rounds. I have them labeled in the pattern as pair A and pair B, and they alternate. So we go back and forth between A and B and A and B, or we start with B, we go back and forth between B and A. So the sizes, some sizes we're going to start with pair A, and some sizes are going to start with pair B, and the pattern will tell you exactly which one to start with according to the size that you're working. So the adult small, which is what I'm working, begins with pair A, which is decrease round pair A. It's a pair of decrease rounds. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by working pair A, because that's what my instructions tell me to work for the size that I'm doing. And for pair A, we're going to purl 1, knit 1, till 4 stitches before the marker. So I'm going to keep purling 1 and knitting 1 until I have 4 stitches left until the marker, which is referring to this first marker in my round. So here we go, I have 4 stitches left before the marker, and I'm going to purl 1. Now here comes the knitwise double decrease. It's kind of the reverse of what we did in our preliminary round if you had it, and it's going to be the reverse of the one we're going to do, which is exactly the same as the one I did a minute ago. That's going to be in decrease round pair B. So I'm on pair A right now. It says purl 1, which I just did. Then it says slip 1 knitwise with yarn in back. So I have the yarn in the back. I'm going to insert my needle knitwise into the next stitch and just slip it. It's not actually going to be done anything with. I'm not going to knit it or anything. Then I'm going to knit 2 together, like so. Those last 2 stitches before the marker get knit together, and then you're going to PSSO, or pass the slip stitch over the stitch you just did, which was a decrease. So we've gotten rid of 2 stitches there. Then we're going to slip the marker. So it says to repeat that sequence 3 more times around. So I'm going to purl 1, knit 1 till 4 stitches before this marker, work the decrease sequence here, purl 1, knit 1 to 4 stitches before this marker, and work the decreases here. Then I'm going to purl 1, knit 1 until 4 stitches before the last marker and work that decrease there, and that will be the end of the round. So here I am 4 stitches before the next marker. I'm going to purl 1, slip 1 knitwise with yarn in back. I'm going to knit 2 together and pass the slip stitch over and slip the marker. And I'm just going to repeat that again with the next marker, purling 1 and knitting 1 until I get till 4 stitches before the marker, and then repeating that double decrease. So just follow the specific instructions that are written for the size that you are working. If you need to start with pair B, go ahead and start with pair B. But I'm just going to finish up the first round of decrease round pair A, and then I will show you how to work pair B. Alright, so here I am at the end of my round. I've finished up that last decrease right there. I'm going to slip the end of round marker, and because it's a pair of decrease rounds, the other half of the pair, which is round 2 of pair A, is knit 1, purl 1 around. So I'm going to work that round, and as I go around, I'm just going to slip the mid-round markers, the light purple markers, until I get back to my dark purple marker, which is the end of the round. Alright, so I am to the end of my round. Now that was round 2 of pair A, decrease round pair A. And now, because we're supposed to alternate those decrease rounds, both pairs of decrease rounds, I'm going to work pair B, which is the opposite of pair A. So for pair B, for round 1 of pair B, I'm going to knit 1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1, etc., until 4 stitches before the first marker. So there we are. I am at 4 stitches before the marker. I'm going to knit 1, and it says to slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, purl 2 together, and pass that slip stitch over. So there's my decrease. It's the same decrease I did in my preliminary round because that's what my size called for. Your size may have called for something else, but regardless, you will need to be able to do both of those decrease sequences to work the decrease part of the hat. And it's not as complicated as it sounds. It might sound complicated right now, but once you go and read through the pattern and start working the hat and you start working the decreases, it's not really that complicated. So I've slipped my marker. I'm going to knit 1, purl 1 to 4 stitches before the next marker. And then I'm going to knit 1. I'm going to slip 1 purlwise with yarn in front, purl 2 together, and PSSO, or pass the slip stitch over, and slip my marker. So I'm just going to keep repeating that. I'm going to repeat it again with this marker and with that last marker, and then I will show you the second round of decrease round pair B. Alright, so here I am almost at the end of my round. I'm going to finish up that last decrease. And now we're going to work the second round of decrease round pair B, which is just purl one and knit one around. And we're going to slip the markers that are in the middle of the round that are marking our decreases. So that is the second round of pair B. And what you're going to do is you're going to alternate working both pairs of decrease rounds until you have completed the correct number of pairs of decrease rounds for the size that you're making. So if your size started with pair B, then you should have gone with B first, then A. Then you're going to keep doing B, then A, then B, then A until you have the correct number of decrease rounds. And if your size started with pair A, like mine did, then you're going to do pair A, then pair B, then pair A, then pair B, until you have the correct number of decrease rounds. So I'm going to continue repeating and alternating both pairs of decrease rounds, but at the moment, my hat, I could probably do another couple pairs of decrease rounds before it would be too small for my 16-inch needle, but I'm going to go ahead and switch to the 32-inch right now. So what I'm going to do is, here's my left needle. This is why I love interchangeable needles. My left needle is going to stay put. My right needle, I'm going to pull on the cable, and I'm going to get one of these little cable end caps. And these little things screw onto the end of your cables so that the stitches don't slide off. So I'm going to take the little tightening key, insert it into the cable, and I'm going to remove the right needle tip, and I'm going to screw on the end cap so that my stitches that are already finished don't fall off the needle. So that is going to hold the stitches that I've already done. Then I'm going to take the right needle tip and I'm going to screw it onto my 32-inch cable, which is meant to be 32 inches long with the needle tips attached, and that is with the longer needle tips attached. So these are the short tips, the short Knit Picks tips, and so it isn't going to be quite 32 inches, but it's okay, it's still plenty long enough. Then I'm going to take the other end cap and screw it onto the other end of the 32-inch cable. And just tighten it up with the tightening key. So now what I've got is I've essentially got two really long circulars with only one end. So I'm going to take the cap end of that one and bring it around like this. I'm just going to hold it because otherwise it's going to bang all over the table and you won't be able to hear me talking. So I've got my right needle on its own cable now. This is a 32-inch cable. And I'm going to knit the next round. I'm going to bring the other end cap out of the way. Make sure you don't forget about your marker. And I'm going to bring it up out of the way because I don't want it to twist with my yarn. So now I'm going to start knitting the next round, which for me is going to be decrease round pair A, but you can do whatever the round is that's next for the size that you're making. And I'm just going to start knitting around my project until all of my stitches are on my 32-inch cable. Alright, so I am just about done with the round that I'm on. I've almost used up all the stitches on my 16-inch needle. And this is actually the beginning / end of my round, so I need to make sure that my marker is slipped. So now all of my stitches are on this 32-inch cable, but I only have one needle tip. So I'm going to take off the end cap off of the cable of my circular needle, and I'm going to take off the needle tip, which is my right needle tip, off of the short cable, the 16-inch cable. And I'm going to now attach the needle tip to the 32-inch cable. So I now have a 32-inch cable from the same needle tips, which I really like because I personally don't like switching between materials knitting needle materials, as you know, if I were to have knit the lower part with circulars that are wood, and then knit the decreased part with double points that were metal, or double points or circulars that were a different material, then sometimes that can mess with your gauge. So I like to stick with the same needle material. This is laminated birch. When you switch to the second needle, whether it be the second circular needle, the longer circular, or the double points. And the reason we're using a longer circular is to do the magic loop. So the magic loop is a way to knit short circumferences on a long needle. And so I'm now going to work the second round of the pair of decreased rounds that I am currently doing. And so I'm going to push my left needle all the way back into the stitches so that I've got stitches to knit on my left needle. And I'm going to bring this excess cable around like this and make a loop around my hand. And so then I can just knit as if that extra cable wasn't there. And that will allow me to knit at a smaller and smaller circumference with a longer circular needle and not have to mess with double points. So once you've got your work switched over to either your double points or your longer circular, then you can just go ahead and keep working the pairs of decreased rounds, alternating. I'm going to keep doing that until I have the correct number of pairs of decreased rounds specified for the size that I'm working. Alright, so I have finished the correct number of pairs of decreased rounds for the size that I'm working. And as with all sizes, no matter what size you're working, and no matter whether you're working sport weight or worsted weight version, at this point you should always have 16 stitches left. So first of all, I just want to show you, before I show you how to close this up, what the magic loop will look like in this setup here, because we're using the magic loop kind of as a replacement for double pointed needles. So as you saw me when I was starting the decreases, I only looped it once, but here I have looped it at every marker. So as I go around, for example, when I finish a round, it's going to look more like this when it's finished, because I would have just been knitting off of this needle. So if I had just finished knitting off of this needle, then to go on and knit the next section, I would slide the needle back into those stitches and then pull on the slack in those loops, like so, pull that other needle tip forward and loop it as well. And just like with double points, you always have to kind of give the yarn a little tug after you knit the first stitch off of the next section, because it's kind of like knitting on flexible double points. So for the final round, you should always have 16 stitches left at this point, and so the final round is going to be the same for all sizes, except that if your last pair of decreased rounds was pair A, then there's a round instructions for that, and if your last pair was pair B, then there are separate round instructions for that. Now my last pair of decreased rounds was pair A, so I'm going to work the correct final round for that, and that is going to be to knit one, slip one purlwise with yarn in front, purl two together, pass the slip stitch over, and slip the marker. So I'm going to let that marker fall around to the needle tip so I can slip it. So I now have 2 stitches left on that segment. I'm going to bring the left needle into those next 4, the next group of stitches, and just take up the slack in the loops to give enough slack to turn the next needle. And as always, if you don't like this method, you can always use double points. So I'm going to repeat the same thing. I'm going to knit one, slip one purlwise with yarn in front, purl two together, pass the slip stitch over, or PSSO, and I'm going to slip the marker. So now we're going to go into that next group of stitches by sliding the left needle back and taking up some of this extra slack in the cable so that I can pull it for this needle and turn to work the next section. I'm going to knit one, slip one purlwise with yarn in front, purl two together, pass the slip stitch over, and slip the marker. So I've only got one left now. I've got 4 stitches left on this segment as well, which is the correct number. So we're going to pull up the slack on all those loops. And you can use, as long as your needle is at least your circular needle is at least 32 inches long, you should be able to do this, but a longer one would not hurt. So you can use a longer one for this quadruple magic loop thing. So again, I'm going to knit one, slip one purlwise with yarn in front, purl two together, pass the slip stitch over, and slip my end of round marker. So that is the very last of the knitting. You should have a total of 8 stitches left, which is 2 stitches on each segment. I've got 2 stitches here, 2 stitches here, 2 stitches here, and 2 stitches here. So now what we're going to do is cut the yarn, and you're going to leave a tail for this so that you can finish it up. And what we're going to do is we're going to get a yarn needle with, of course, an eye that's the appropriate size for the thickness of the yarn. And we're going to thread this tail through the yarn needle. So we're going to go ahead and remove the markers as we come to them. So I'm going to slide my left needle back. I'm going to insert my yarn needle into those 2 stitches. So the yarn is going through the center of both of them. I can pull the needle out, remove the next marker, bring the needle back through the next 2 stitches, insert my yarn needle into both of those stitches in the center of them, pull the needle out, pull the yarn needle through, and remove the next marker. And now I can pull the slack in that loop to get to those next 2 stitches. And I'm going to again insert my yarn needle into both of them and through, and remove the needle. And then I can remove that next marker. I've only got 2 stitches left, so I'm just going to slide it all the way to the left needle tip and put my yarn needle through both of them again. So now we're just going to tug on the yarn needle to close up this little hole. We're cinching it shut, so I'm just going to tug on it, and it's very secure. I'm going to insert my needle into the center of that little hole. That is no longer a hole because we closed it, so that we bring the yarn to the inside. And then I'm going to pick up a couple little strands of yarn right here next to where it came out, and I'm going to make a knot just because I feel that that's more secure, and I recommend that you do the same. And now I'm just going to weave in these 2 tails. I've got a tail on the inside of the hat from where we cinched it closed, and I've got a tail on the ribbing. Now I just want to show you here how that, because we worked these decreases in pattern where that we didn't mess up the knit or purl stitches, you can't really see them. But we have 4 columns of decreases that come up to the center, and so because they are worked in the knits and purls so that they are not distorting the moss stitch pattern or breaking it up, then they're pretty much invisible. They're very hard to see if you don't know where they are. Right around here is where we started to decrease the crown of the hat, and we kind of make a little bit of a square here on the top because we have 4 columns of decreases that come together in this center point. So I'm going to weave in the tails, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like. So here we have the finished hat, and I think it's a really good balance between the texture up here of the moss stitch and still have that ribbing at the bottom, and it's comfortable. It's nice and soft and stretchy, and as most hats, this hat is designed with a little bit of negative ease, meaning that the actual circumference of the hat is just a little bit smaller than the circumference of the head, so that it stretches just a little bit to go onto the head, and it stays on and it's comfortable. It's warm and close fitting, but it's not going to slide off for being too big. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you would like to make this hat, then you can go and get the free written pattern on my website. And if you do, I'd love to hear how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure to click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching. Bye.